Welcome to the final episode of this special three-part series on climate change and security. I'm Clint Watts, a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. My thanks to Aaron Stein and the listeners of Chain Reaction for this opportunity. On November 3rd of 2021, world leaders met at the UN Climate Change Conference in Scotland to devise global measures to stem rising world temperatures. I'm a national security researcher who is interested in climate change, and yet I barely paid attention to the headlines coming out of the summit or the sessions. We've seen promises and pledges to stop climate change for 2 decades, and the outcome of the COP26 session felt eerily familiar and ineffective. During the height of the pandemic, America saw rapid shifts as the virus shuttered businesses and closed major cities. The pandemic, we hope, will be temporary, but climate change is here to stay. International measures to slow climate change have been too little and too late, and the consequences of global inaction increasingly affect daily life here in the U.S. Jesse Keenan is an associate professor of real estate at Tulane University in New Orleans. His research focuses on the intersections of climate change adaptation and the built environment, which includes aspects of design, engineering, regulation, urban planning, and financing. We spoke to him about how climate change will impact the United States and where Americans should go in the face of an altering world. Jesse, shoot straight with me. Are we cooked?
Well, I think wealthy folks will be okay. Less wealthy folks will be less okay. And there will be some contingent in a country of growing inequality where many people will be not so okay. And that plays out in everything from if you're a blue collar worker, getting less hourly wages because it's too hot to work outside, or you have a greater likelihood of skin cancer in the armed forces because you're spending so much time outside, right down to the impacts on GDP, right? And those impacts on GDP are estimated to far exceed any measure of growth that we have for the foreseeable future. And that's not even accounting for the costs of adaptation. So I think we're looking at a broader decline in wealth and a broader decline in our standard of living, whether we like it or not.
So Jesse, that sort of trend line you're talking about in the U.S., do you see it other places in the world right now? Meaning, has that acceleration, those dynamics, those currents, are there other places in the world where that's already happening today and you can witness it and kind of see that might be what the U.S. is going to become down the road?
It's already happening in the United States in some dimension. This is not a future existential point in time where you cross a threshold and all of a sudden one is in a diminished state. It's a gradual and incremental set of processes that are defined by shocks and stresses. And we're in that. The question is there a country or is there a particular economy somewhere in the world that's already crossed that terminal threshold of no return? I don't think we're there yet, but certainly for many people in the world and many people in the United States, things are quite dire.
Okay, I'm an investor. I know climate change is happening, and despite the inaction or small actions of governments, I know this is coming. It seems like a better's opportunity and also a more realistic forcing function in some degrees, meaning markets can change things quicker and easier sometimes than government regulation. So how is that happening in the financial space? Are they betting on climate change? Are they accepting climate change? Or is it more about benevolent investment? Or is it all of the above?
Yeah, I would not rely on altruism as a driver of any true market correction or revaluation. I mean, people are taking all sides of the bets of climate change. There's people who are betting in every direction. We see this in derivatives markets. We see it at nearly every conduit of levels of finance, from mortgages right down to the food on our dinner table, and the impact that things like droughts and the costs of water and irrigation have on our food system. So you name it, we can walk down this trajectory from which there are people making bets in all different directions.
Let's rewind for a second. Jesse, you're in Philadelphia today, but is it correct you're a professor in New Orleans at Tulane University?
That's correct.
So a city that's below sea level. And, I remember back Hurricane Katrina in 2005, at the time it was seen as an indicator or a place of climate change. I don't know if that's correct or not. How is it for New Orleans? Is that part of the reason that you're there, or is it just coincidence? And, how does it affect that town and community? It seems like it'd be a natural lab to kind of understand some of these dynamics.
Yeah, I had a somewhat sadistic ambition to leave the comforts of Cambridge and go to a place like Tulane, which has a very strong history of interdisciplinarity and environmental science and policy and economics and all of these things that I care about, and go to a place like New Orleans, which is in a sort of terminal state of decline. And its terminal state of decline has been registered for well over 100 years. The reality is that the wealth that's been created through petrochemicals and the fossil fuel industries have not been redistributed in an equitable manner, whether through labor force participation or dividends in any way. And so the extreme inequality, together with the extreme nature of environmental exposure in New Orleans, makes it a very unique case study, but one that's not so different from many places in America. So the challenge to adapt to climate change there is a supreme challenge, and it's one that I find personally interesting, even though it comes at great cost to live in New Orleans by virtue of the fact that any given hurricane season, it could be totally wiped off the map.
So that kind of leads me to places in the U.S. Right now we hear about scorching temperatures, forest fires, rising seas, superstorms, wild fluctuations in the weather, and drought and humidity in different ways between the West and the East. But from your perspective, what does climate change actually look like in the U.S. beyond some of the sensationalized headlines? Seems like it always happens slower than people anticipate, but it's very clear, I think, to many of us now. What are the areas that are most at risk, and which ones do you think maybe benefit in some weird way?
Climate change should be understood as a series of shocks and stresses. And it's not just the extreme events necessarily that are at work. And we understand that in terms of hurricanes and floods and things like that. It's really the stress of climate change. But when it rains, it floods. This extreme precipitation is a real hazard. Extreme heat is also increasingly having huge impacts. And we're understanding those impacts not just in terms of labor productivity or labor output formally, or public health dimensions, but also the human development dimensions. There's plenty of places in the United States where schools do not have air conditioning, but the climate has changed since the construction of the schools to dictate that those classrooms are too hot and they have too high a concentration of carbon dioxide. You can begin to think about the human developmental consequences of not fulfilling our education promise to children of America because it's too hot in the classroom. But there's many, many implications and impacts associated with climate change and first and second order effects that really exacerbate existing challenges with affordability and accessibility of goods and services and resources in this country. And we're certainly not heading in the right direction. Independent of climate change, we have many, many governance challenges and many other things that we could talk about that represent severe constraints or institutional constraints, and climate change merely works among those in the context of global change to make it more complicated, more complex, and more dangerous.
If there's one place in the U.S. you don't want to be in 2040, Jesse, where these things really start to hit home, that you just see as being sort of the epicenter of where these things happen, what do you think it would be in terms of the biggest stressors hitting kind of consecutively or consistently year after year?
Coastal Louisiana, coastal Carolinas, some parts of coastal Texas, parts of inland California. There are plenty of risks from which we will cross some measure of threshold associated with extreme events that impose costs, health costs, economic costs, social costs, that begin to drive people to make decisions about where and how to live in ways that change our underlying demography. And in this case, we're moving north, and in part, we're moving east, right? And that landscape is one that's going to change our political geography as much as it's going to change our human geography.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I was reading a news story on CNN. You were featured in it. They were talking about Duluth, Minnesota as a potential climate safe haven. I kind of wonder what you thought about that, because I had college classmates that lived in Duluth who just perpetually complained about how it was deadly cold there. But, what's your take on some of these places, upper Midwest or even other locations that become climate safe havens?
Well, I suppose if I were to have some measure of popular notoriety in the United States, it would be for the theory in the sort of future that I've projected about people moving north, and particularly to the upper Midwest, and particularly around the resources of the Great Lakes. I quite publicly presented this work in Duluth, and it was the subject of a New York Times documentary, and it became a sort of popular place to envision what this future may look like in America. I was commissioned by the University of Minnesota a number of years ago to look at Duluth and evaluate it in that context. And I came away from that research, which did a few things, looked at the extent to which the influx of people could reinforce sustainable urban development and not just recreate sprawl, look at the extent to which there were opportunities in public finance to make the necessary investments in infrastructure to adapt. I mean, Duluth will have its own climate impacts, and thinking about environmental quality, particularly the lake, is among those things that one has to consider. But also, in terms of economic development, what would it take for cities like Duluth to engage and market to people? You have to think of climate migration and climate along a continuum. On one end of the continuum are people who are being forced out and displaced and really have nowhere to go. And on the other end of the continuum are people who have the wealth and the elective mobility. And that's what we see now more than anything in the United States, is people are moving because they have the capacity and the means to move. And what's strange about it, and what's strange probably about that CNN piece that you cite, is that people have actually moved there because of this work. And keep in mind, in the prior decade, I think they'd had a fairly stable population with a loss of a gain of about 43 people in a metro area of about 150,000. So it was a relatively stagnant population, but in just a few years, the amount of people that have moved there has been like, I don't know, tenfold. In 2 years, what you saw in a decade or something. It's some enormous amount of people, I mean, small in absolute terms, but large in relative terms, who have begun to think about Duluth, and maybe it's not as cold as you think. So I think you can have this conversation about a lot of cities, Toledo, Ohio, and Rochester, and Burlington, Vermont, and they all have different qualities for varying different reasons about why they may be attractive to different cohorts of people.
So Jesse, that's a weird conundrum, right? So like, it seems as if, and I know this from my relatives live in the Mississippi River Valley, right? And a lot of those areas have flooded out over the last 20, 30 years in ways that are unusual. And so they might be paid by the Corps of Engineers or by one of these agencies to move, right? Or for the land, because it's cheaper systematically for the government at times to take over property than it is to do the mitigation and protection and recovery and those sorts of things. So why is that better, say, than understanding the market dynamics, right? Like inform people about making a more profitable choice and they make their own decisions, and then the market can maybe move things quicker than government regulation. Like we started off this interview talking about the climate accords and some of these other metrics, and there has been progress, but it's not been progress that has kept up with climate change. So how do you feel about that? I know you work both public and private sector, and so what do you think is a more reasonable way, and why should we be scared of people making money off climate change, I guess is a way to think about it.
I don't think we should be at all. And I have almost zero faith in the public sector to be able to do much about climate change. I mean, this is one of the reasons, and I'd love to talk about the absolute failures of the Biden administration. And keep in mind, I've worked for Democrats and Republicans. I kind of think of myself as a bit of a liberal ideologue in some measure, but I have very little faith in governments to do much about climate change for a lot of different reasons. And I have much more faith, and it's not a perfect faith, and it doesn't mean that there won't be winners and losers in this context, but already much more has been advanced in the name of climate mitigation and adaptation through the operations of financial markets in the last several years than has necessarily been advanced by any single country of the world.
So Jesse, your field, a lot of it is adaptation to climate change. For most people, I imagine they think about it as more efficient air conditioning, solar panels, better light bulbs, those sorts of things on a personal level. And so for friends, family, coworkers, what do you recommend to them in terms of how to conduct their life, prepare for the challenges? If you were having Thanksgiving dinner at someone's house, what would be the one or two things that you try and pass on to them about things they could think about or do, moving forward?
I have no advice for people. There's nothing really you can do other than trying to inform yourself about your own local decisions and delaying home ownership in some contexts and keeping debt low and not having children and all of the things that speak to the management of risk in your life. But those are probably over exaggerations and overestimates of the true nature of risk. We tend to overestimate the climate in our daily lives, probably among people who work in climate, right? Because it's an attribution bias, right? There's a phenomenon in behavioral science when you're around people of a like mind, you come out with a more extreme version of your orientation to reality than is necessary. So in many ways, we probably overestimate risk and climate risk among those who work in climate, amongst our peers and family. But really, I have no words of wisdom except enjoy things now. And, a lot of people, particularly my parents' age, I tell them, you were born at kind of the right time in the course of human history, because things are only going to get worse from here on out. So, live it up while you can. Go ahead and just go to McDonald's and eat the steak while you can, because it won't be around for long.
It's great to be a baby boomer, right? I think that's the lesson learned of all these trajectories. That was Jesse Keenan, a professor of real estate at Tulane University in New Orleans. I hope you enjoyed this series of conversations on climate change and its effect on global security and our daily lives. In the coming weeks, I'll have another series of discussions closely tied to these episodes on climate change. We'll look at how migration has and will continue to be a driving force in international security, one that's amplified by the dynamic shifts in our climate. In the meantime, thanks to Aaron Stein and to you, the listeners of Chain Reaction, for this opportunity to bring you a new perspective on climate change and our security. This episode was produced by Sophia James and Sophia Curzius. I'm Clint Watts at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and you can follow me on Twitter at the username @SelectedWisdom. Thanks for listening.